Taxes can be used to discourage certain behaviours that we want less of, and ultimately, if those taxes are effective, we get no revenue. Otherwise, taxes are used to raise revenue on behalf of the state or other taxation authorities in order to redistribute purchasing power within society. Those taxes are economically efficient if they can be levied in such a way that they do not change behaviour in ways that make them transactionally cost less or at least very low cost, and as a consequence raise revenue efficiently. In New Zealand today, we have a significant problem. And my topic of how do we square the triangle is based on the notion that in New Zealand today, we tax income. We have pretty broad-based income taxes. We tax expenditure through our GST. And we have some, but not very comprehensive taxes based on profit. We also have a limited amount of capital tax, which is used to fund local but not central government. We also have taxes which central government effectively levy in the name of unavoidable user charges or excess economic rents that accrue to state-owned or partially state-owned enterprises. We can run around the maypole asserting that more economic efficiency in what we spend our taxed revenues on will somehow enable us to have more for less. My assertion is that we should always raise taxes efficiently and spend our money wisely, and in some circumstance finance what we are purchasing by the state through appropriate levels of debt. But even if we decide in New Zealand today that our taxation of income is relatively efficient, even if not equitable, and our taxation of expenditure is relatively efficient, if not equitable, it is hard to argue our taxation of profits, of wealth, and capital is either efficient or equitable. Let us assume for a minute that we therefore are in the market for new ideas about how to raise the revenue that is going to be needed in order to finance efficient spending with appropriate borrowing to provide the infrastructure and services that we both want, need, and can indeed afford. And the conclusion I have come to is that we need to do 21st century creative thinking about how we might raise taxes efficiently to fund the services that we need. And there are two particular themes that I would present to you for your analysis and challenge. One is, has the time come when we need to tax data transfer? And has the time come when we should have a comprehensive and efficient tax for the use of natural capital? Let me for a moment dwell on data and then come to the major theme, which is natural capital. In the 21st century, it is pretty clear that the virtual economy, that is the economy structured around the creation, distribution, and consumption of digital materials, which did not exist until the latter part of the 20th century and is growing exponentially in the 21st century, represents an untaxed but still taxable source of revenue. Particularly for a small island nation, it is quite conceivable that we could tax between country data transfer both in and out of New Zealand. That this tax would be at an extremely low rate, but because of the size and growth of volumes, it would be likely to be a tax that's subject to me plugging in my laptop. You can hear more about. That the tax on data or data transfer between countries would certainly create revenue streams that were likely to grow in the future. Data coming into New Zealand and leaving New Zealand, usually in volumes, moves through cables, which are limited in number and easily identifiable. Data coming via satellite is usually received and distributed from ground stations in New Zealand when it moves at volume. And further, with the development and emergence of data transfer technologies from handheld devices, every one of those devices has a registered IP address, and the data volumes are already monitored and tracked by service providers. So I believe that in the 21st century, it's not just a matter about higher income tax rates, although they may be both justified and necessary, or higher taxes on expenditure, or they too may be justified and necessary. But it is also a matter of thinking about economically efficient taxes that are least likely to change behaviour and most likely to be efficient in the cost-effective sense of being able to raise revenue. Leave that idea to one side. It may or may not have merits, and certainly it would not be welcome by the large multi-glomerate data companies. But let's now talk about natural capital. It is very clear that the natural capital that we in New Zealand have should always be thought of as being owned by the public, that's you and me, and only ever offered to the private sector for profit on terms which we, the people, think are fair and reasonable. This is a fundamental departure from the most common view of natural capital, which is that if I own the land, I get exclusive use of the land. Although in New Zealand, all mineral rights, that is to the natural capital below the surface, is owned by the state that may then license access to it and charge royalties from it. But we do not have a systematic and comprehensive way of making sure that those who seek to profit by degrading natural capital would actually contribute revenue to the state for the purpose of meeting other expenditures. The natural capital in New Zealand is, in some tactile sense, easy to identify. Minerals, land, water, the near shore. But natural capital may also come to include solar energy and wind. And is it unreasonable to assume that those who seek to profit from the privatization of natural capital should not be required to make a contribution to health, education, social cohesion, and security as they exploit the natural capital which they believe entitled to use? A comprehensive and systematic identification, measurement, monitoring, and indeed monetization of natural capital would both lead to the more careful use of natural capital as well as a potential revenue stream for the state. These are only two ideas of many, but I think we need to think more creatively about the sources of revenue that this and future governments are likely to need. And that does not ignore both the opportunities for taxes on capital, wealth, or asset transfers, It simply says that too often the debate on taxes has been narrowly focused on old levers, old ways of doing business, old forms of sources of private prosperity given public infrastructure or publicly owned assets. I don't claim to be an expert on our tax system. I don't claim to be an environmental expert. And I don't claim to be expert in the digital economy. But it would be fair to say that being captured by the past is unlikely to be the best gateway to the future. And what is increasingly obvious is that our expectations of state-provided services, health, education, social security, not to mention the other things we as a modern society have come to expected universal access to, is going to require additional resources. And the hubris of asserting that we can have it all by just being more efficient with what we spend seems to be an unhelpful contribution to the public debate needed. I'm more interested in your questions and how we might tease out this conversation, and particularly in light of our slightly interrupted start, why don't we now move to questions and discussion? I'm back to our MC. Kia ora.
Kia ora, Rod. Thank you so much for that. That was really succinct and powerful. Just while the first questions are coming in, I had one question. As you talked about potentially, taxing solar and wind and rain, or for example, as natural capital, do you think looking at doing that might have, impacts on disincentivizing renewables, for example?
Well, I think the first thing is if you are going to tax, you need to understand the behavioral impact. That if we were taxing those things in their use of natural capital for the generation of electricity, then you would tax electricity generation, whether it was from carbon or renewables. You might, in addition, charge for the carbon emissions of those types of combustions of fossil fuel in the open air, as well as your essential energy tax. But wind and solar shouldn't be subject merely to first user or first abuser advantage.
Thank you. That makes a lot of sense. We had a question from someone this morning about the framing of the question and the topic. Do you want to ask that just out loud?
So let me just preface the framing of the initial question as squaring of the triangle. The triangle is basically my assertion that predominantly we tax income, we tax expenditure, and the third leg is we seek to tax profits. What we in New Zealand fail to do is to look at opportunities to tax in other ways. That would include capital gains, wealth, capital transfer taxes, be they between citizens or intergenerationally, or natural capital taxes, digital cap. In other words, all of the other things square the circle, which currently is very reliant, as I say, on income taxes, expenditure taxes, and hard to enforce profit taxes.
That makes sense. Robin has asked, should New Zealand power companies be nationalised? And others, please feel free to put your questions in the chat.
The trouble with nationalisation is it does become a licence for a tax by any other name. What we have is the interesting situation in New Zealand today, where we have these partially owned, state-owned enterprises, where the minority shareholders get to free ride on the economic rents which are sought by the state in lieu of taxes for the provision of electricity. So the challenge with all of that is if you really just want to tax kilojoules of energy, you should have an energy tax, irrespective of whether it's state-owned or privately owned. If you want to secure the delivery of cheap electricity, I'm not entirely convinced that the state-owned model will in time give you the dynamic efficiency for the delivery of advanced technology ways of generating and distributing electricity. State ownership of some things doesn't impede the quality of delivery, but state ownership of some other things does seem to be associated with a loss of dynamic efficiency.
Thank you, Rodd. And anyone who wants to challenge that can put that in the chat. Lynn, so we have a question. Is there examples of where this has been done successfully elsewhere that we can draw upon?
More comprehensive taxes on natural capital do exist, particularly in Europe. I don't believe anywhere somebody has attempted the equivalent of taxing cross-border data transfer. In other words, a digital tax.
And Lynn is concerned that pricing natural capital itself buys into neoclassical economics, and framing everything in the market, and not recognizing that, the things we value most, like love and nature and relationships, aren't part of the market economy. How would you respond to that critique, Rodd?
I think it's a fair concern, but here's the challenge. If you were to levy natural capital and its use in the pursuit of private profit, and as a consequence have more discerning use of public property, you may end up with better environmental outcomes than the slightly more cumbersome tools of regulation, which still leave private profits from the extraction, degradation, and in some cases, destruction of natural capital. So it is a trade-off. I'm not asserting that you can get a free ride here. But is there the possibility that you get better use of natural capital if it is subject to a levy, which goes to the public purse, rather than the current arrangement, which is private profit, if you can, subject to regulatory constraints, which appear to be hard to consistently apply because the incentives on our elected leaders are driven by stakeholders with vested interests.
That makes sense. Another question is from Kate. What do you think about hypothecation of taxing of natural capital, for example, to fund our climate change response?
Yes, of course, Treasury, the New Zealand Treasury, detest hypothecated taxes with a passion. They are just, for 50 years, have steadfastly objected to any form because even our road user charges for a long time contributed to the consolidated revenue and not to the building of roads. The proceeds of auctions in the New Zealand emissions trading scheme, as flawed as it is, were for a very limited time ring-fenced in order to provide resources to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. That lasted only one government. So the challenge with hypothecation is the credibility of the promise that the taxes raised will be used for a ring-fenced purpose. Personally, I'm more in favour of hypothecated taxes as a citizen than the New Zealand Treasury is as a bureaucracy, because the bureaucracy working to a government of the day will always want as many degrees of freedom as possible in how to use and allocate funds. But as a citizen, I'm somewhat more inclined to think if I've paid a tax for a purpose, I'd quite like the purpose for which I paid the tax to be served.
And given that comment, Rodd, and also given your previous comment about state ownership, I mean, the fact that, for example, with our energy companies, so much of the revenue goes back into the Treasury purse and makes the Treasury books look good. I'm interested if you have any comments around, I guess, how that influences Treasury advice, influences, political responses to these issues.
Well, Richard Prebble famously once said SOEs were a halfway house, that either you would renationalize them or fully privatize them because of this sort of series of challenges that come. So the state owns 51%, which sounds like a controlling interest. But the minute it seeks to exercise control other than for the benefit of all shareholders, minority shareholders have an action against the majority shareholder for oppressing their interests. So essentially, you've set up this, we can't control it, but we own 51% of it, and the entity needs to operate in the interests of all shareholders, not just the majority shareholder. Consequentially, if you can extract economic rents, that is, profits beyond the needed rate of return to maintain the capital stock, then essentially the 49% get a free ride while the state seeks to offset other sources of revenue through its tax-like behaviour as a shareholder. So I do think there are some real problems with that model that are not necessarily resolved by making the state the 100% owner.
Thanks, Rod. That's a great answer. On a slightly different question, we've got one from Lynn Roberts saying, the assumption is that we can accurately price natural capital, but pricing is done from marginal cost-benefit framing, goes against the reality that functioning nature is essential for our survival. You know, there's no amount of money that will compensate for the loss. Like, how do you feel about that? And she suggested a Tobin tax of, 0.5% on money transfers.
Yeah, so the Tobin tax is a bit of the early forerunner of the idea of a digital data tax, right? Where it's a small amount on everything that moves and therefore arguably won't change behaviour a lot, but will raise revenue. So Tobin tax is essentially a subset, given that now the whole banking system is digital. Every financial transaction, other than the cash ones in the economy, are going to be caught by a data tax or a digital tax. So whether you're watching Netflix or moving your money around, it's still a data transfer. So you're right to use the Tobin tax as analogous to a much broader data tax. The natural capital, think of it as a levy, right? It's not creating a market with a willing buyer and a willing seller of natural capital. You are essentially creating a levy on the use for private profit of natural capital. And it therefore is more analogous to a royalty than some sort of either profit share or marketplace. And therefore you may simply say, that if you are using a natural resource such as a river, that you are going to pay a levy, whether you use that river to sprinkle it on your land for growing food, or you use it for generating electricity. You are using and therefore subject to make a contribution to the public purse for the use of that resource. So I think that's the construct we're trying to create, which is not the same construct as a willing buyer, willing seller set a price, because the evidence can be, as it is in the ETS, that market price may be far below the price that is appropriate given the future state of humanity. Because I too agree with you that once you start doing cost-benefit analysis and discounting the future at 7% per annum, you halve the value of the future every 10 years, meaning that stuff beyond 40 years is, quote, valueless. And that cannot be the right price of the future.
Absolutely. And I know that Wellbeing Economy Alliance has also done some great work on that as well. We've got a question from economist Bill Rosenberg, the former policy director of trade unions. Bill has two questions. Firstly, about your idea of taxing data transfer. And he says it seemingly was put to the WTO in 98 for a moratorium on customs duties on electronic transmissions. And Bill's asking, have you thought much about how much of a barrier that is, and what precedent it set in 98? And his second question is about any estimate of the cost to New Zealand about climate change, whether playing our part in reducing emissions or mitigating it.
Yeah, so let's start on the cross-border. We've passed, rightly or wrongly, we've passed the high water mark of globalization and free trade. Thank you, Donald Trump. Donald Trump is a symptom of a wider problem. His solution to this kind of problem is that you can see things as they cross the border, And so the idea of going back to the 19th and 18th century taxes on physical trade across borders, partly as a revenue raiser for the state, but also as a promoter of domestic activity behind that barrier, is not new to humanity. And in fact, it is reasonably recent that we universally agreed that low to zero trade barriers were in everybody's interest. By the way, it is particularly the interest of small island nations like New Zealand that barriers to trade should be low, that we are never going to produce most of the things we need, and we are going to produce things in quantities that we don't need. So it is economically efficient for us to trade. The larger your block, the smaller the gains from trade, even if they are still real. But we have seen with the European Union, we have seen now with the United States, that there are short-term economic payoffs for raising protection, even if the medium to long term, the cost structure in your society will be higher. But the idea of a cross-border digital tax back in 1998, it was the high water mark of free trade, free movement of capital, free movement of labor, free movement of goods and services. And in that context, the free movement of data would have seemed entirely consistent with that global philosophy. Every sovereign nation is going to struggle to fund the level of services that its citizenship wants. And so I think we need to be open-minded in the 21st century about what other opportunities there might be. When it comes to the natural capital, it is pretty clear that we are already facing the economic consequences of our attitude towards the use and abuse of the environment, including the combustion of fossil fuels and emissions to air, that those costs are going to continue to rise. It is reasonably hard to estimate exactly how much is weather and how much is underlying climate change. And even if you are getting better at the science of attribution, the reality is the changing climate is going to impose real costs on agricultural production. It is going to impose real costs on infrastructure, wear, tear, maintenance, and replacement. And it is going to be the source of real costs to our health, both mental and physical health. So whether we can tag a price or just recognize increasing cost, I think is a fair question. The challenge for us all is that unless we are honest about the fact that not all the costs and losses from the changing climate will be compensated for, even if it was not, quote, your fault, is the reality of what is going to emerge. Not every road that is subject to slip, not every bridge that was ever built will be replaced. Not every low-lying housing estate can be protected at no cost. So the costs of mitigation, that is reducing emissions, are real and beginning to emerge in product prices and consumer preferences. But the cost of adaptation are likely to be significantly higher and are inherently local.
Thank you, Rod. It's great how you can answer such different questions from such a variety of things. We've got two more questions. One from Brent Smith, which is about would reducing GST on New Zealand-made products help? And specifically, and the other question is from Deborah Rhodes, which is, what are your thoughts on a levy on agricultural methane, for example, and would that be based on output like milk solids, or should it be based on per hectare?
Okay, so let's do the GST that we have in New Zealand today benefits from its comprehensiveness and simplicity. I'm a big fan of comprehensive and simple taxes that are hard to avoid and have low costs to administer and enforce. What I would fear is if you use GST, which is largely about raising the revenue, to try and now incentivize domestic production, you would be fraught with the challenge of what is, quote, the value of a final product produced in New Zealand as distinct from the value of the components which might have been produced overseas. And God forbid we should get back to the nonsense of getting cars from Japan that were deconstructed to be shipped to New Zealand to be reassembled in Petone. That kind of perverse behavior in the real economy as a result of how we choose to protect jobs or raise revenue needs to be avoided if at all possible. It has real economic costs and losses which are observable and avoidable. So I, for one, would prefer not to use GST other than as a purely revenue-raising instrument, broad-based, comprehensive, not necessarily at a higher rate than today. It is a regressive tax in the sense of the proportion of wealthy people's income that is spent is lower than the proportion of poor people's income. But that's a distributional issue that should be, even if it is not currently, should be addressed through economic transfers to support lower income and more vulnerable households. When it comes to methane, this is pure politics. This is not science, and in the end will turn out not to be rational. That the reason you put a price on methane is to reward those who are more efficient at producing agricultural output with low levels of methane emissions. So I'll share some data with you. I'm a director of ASB Bank. ASB Bank have $8 billion lent to dairy farmers, about 1 in every $5 of dairy lending in New Zealand. The average greenhouse gas emissions per kilo of milk solids produced using GWP 100 measures is roughly 10.5 kilos of greenhouse gases per kilo of milk solids across our portfolio, which is within a margin of error of what the national average is. So we reckon we've on average got an average dairy herd. But the difference between the herds, now that we have the data, is extraordinary. Our highest emitting funded dairy herds are emitting 18 kilos of greenhouse gases per kilo of milk solids, and our lowest are at 8. So the between herd difference in New Zealand is way bigger than the average difference between sovereign states such as New Zealand and Ireland. So it is a complete nonsense to argue that because our average may be within a hair's breadth of Ireland, if we got rid of our 18 kilos per kilo of our worst emitting herds and it was replaced by an average Irish herd, the world would have the same milk protein and lower emissions. The leakage argument is neither economically nor technically true. So yes, I would tax methane emissions. I would provide rewards for those who take up the better breeding, feeding, farm management practices and land use, which has lower emissions per kilo of milk solids produced.
Thank you, Rodd. We're just a little bit over. Do you have another 10 minutes and then we'll wrap up?
Yep.
Cool. Thank you, everyone. We'll just go about 10 minutes over, including the wrap up, because this is such great stuff. So one of our last two questions are, we've got one from Robin saying, do you differentiate user pays, healthcare, education, and so on, from taxing all natural, data and commons resources?
Yeah, so of course, if you've got a data tax, then the user is effectively paying. If it's a bit rate tax, the more you use, the more you'll pay. So you can think of that as a levy, you can think of it as tax, or you can think it as user pays. The argument is that the data is so omnipresent in society now that you wouldn't not use data because of a very small bit tax that is spread around society. So when we come to user pays, and I think this government has announced that any new built roads of national significance will be tolled, you come back to this argument about when does a user pay become a tax by any other name? Because if it is a levy on a state-provided asset where you have no choice but to use it, that to me looks like a tax. That only where you have choice, where you could reduce your use or avoid the use, can you really argue that you are paying for the service you chose to access. So when I get to go to McDonald's, I choose to go to McDonald's and I pay the price. That is user pays. If it turns out that the government is the sole provider of a service and I require that service for life, then charging for that service is essentially a tax at the point of consumption.
Thanks, Rod. And our final question is from Marama Finley, who asks about the chicken and the egg. You say that to meet our societal expectations of what the state should provide, we need to be creative in how we raise revenue to pay for those expectations. But she also suggests that the current political climate, the government's trying to alter the social expectations and alter the social fabric of what the state should be providing at all. So how do you see those two playing, interrelating?
I think that's a very insightful observation, that in any democracy, there's going to be this trade-off of how much do we expect the state to provide in total and within the subsectors of that portfolio of spending. How much do we expect the state to borrow the money to provide those services to us today, leaving the debt servicing, because the debt will never get repaid, the debt servicing and reduced capacity to borrow in the future on the next generation of citizens and taxpayers. There's no right answer to that. That is a question at every election for every taxpayer and voter to choose. We seem over 30 years to have systematically rewarded our elected leaders who promised we could have more today and someone else, either now or later, would pay for it. And that is applied to the use of natural capital, it is applied to the use of physical infrastructure, and it has applied to the use of our social services. We have driven down, using the monopsony power of the state, the relative wages of nurses, doctors, teachers, you know the list. And we as taxpayers have been complicit in our voting behaviour in rewarding politicians who have done that in our name. And until we as taxpayers and voters accept a responsibility that we need to pay for the services we insist we are entitled to, this can will keep getting kicked down the road until there is a crisis. And in New Zealand's case, the crisis will manifest itself either through a credit constraint or through a social revolt.
Thanks, Rod. That's fantastic. I'll just, and if there's any final further closing comments you'd like to add. I remember the last time you were asked, well, I heard you ask for closing comments, you accused certain actors of crimes against humanity. So are there any other final comments you'd like to add today?
My final comment is that we as voters need to begin to choose to pick leaders, not followers. That you can't lead a country from the middle of the crowd. You have to have a set of principles that you stand up for and you say, will you rally to my flag? Not, where are you all standing and can I come and stand in the middle of you with my flag? And I think we are in leadership deficit on a number of significant agenda items, including climate and the environment, including our attitude towards families and children, that the reality of the adults in the room is that we are underinvesting in the next generation and the resources that generation will have to use and the options that they will have. That's pretty selfish. And until we change our attitudes as voters about who we elect, we won't change the political leadership. We will get who we vote for.
Thank you, Rodd. That's very powerful, and yeah, we completely agree. As we see the centre right and centre left governments fail to deliver for working people, the environment, I think people are looking for these ideas and this kind of leadership. So I think we all really appreciated your whakaro, and there's lots of comments coming in here about thanking you. So thank you, Rodd, for your contribution. Thank you to everyone else for coming along today, for your fantastic questions. Thank you to background hero Kate, who does a lot of the work setting these events up behind the scenes. Thank you so much, Kate. And again, yeah, so if anyone would be keen to get involved in the Better Taxes campaign or hear more about it, you can do 3 things right now. You can sign up to get involved via the link that Kate's dropped in the chat, and I think is about to drop in the chat again. It'll also be emailed to you. You can fill out the volunteer form that will be sent to you when you sign up. And then for those able to, you can always make a donation via the link Kate just put in the chat. And we'll email you through all of this and the webinar recording. The next session in this Tax on Tuesdays series is about funding. The series is about funding a better Aotearoa, why we need more revenue, of course. And the next session is on what makes for a healthy health system and exploring how we fund health properly. And that will be on November the 4th, next month, on Tuesday, same time, same place. You'll get emailed the details. And the link to register is also in the chat as well, which will be sent out to you after this. And if you sign up to our mailing list, you'll receive notifications of all this cool stuff. So I would recommend signing up to the mailing list. So that's it, admin done. Thanks again to Rodd and everyone. Thank you so much for all the ideas and the challenges you put to us, Rodd. We really appreciate that. And thank you to everyone for engaging and putting your challenges and your ideas in the chat. Thank you, everyone.